Hi and welcome to our new YouTube video. In this tutorial we're going to be building a sign-up form with HTML, CSS and JavaScript. Nowadays we meet sign-in and sign-up forms on almost every website, so this kind of project is going to be interesting and helpful for you because when you work on your projects you should know how to deal with these things. So before we start to write the code, let's go ahead and describe the project. So here we have two different buttons, sign in and sign up, at the top left corner of the page. Then we have here the heading. By default it displays sign in, but we'll program it using JavaScript. Then down below we have a couple of input fields and a submit button. By default there are displayed input fields for signing in, but if I click the sign up button, then we will get here the input fields for registration. Besides that, the project includes a form validation. For example, if I leave the input fields empty and click the submit button, then we will get the error messages saying that email and password are required. If I fill, for example, one of the inputs, let's say the password, and click the submit button, then the input field will get a green border, which means that we have entered the valid data in the input field. Okay, so the project is going to be responsive to different screen sizes. If I inspect the page and switch to the responsive mode, you will find that the project is responsive. We built this project for extra large screen size. I mean the screen size with 1920 pixels of width and 1080 pixels of height. So if you're using a relatively smaller screen size, then the project might not look quite good during the tutorial, but do not worry, at the end of the day we will make it responsive. In the meantime, you can switch to the responsive mode, set the width and height for the extra large screen size, and follow me. Alright, as we said, the project is going to be built based on HTML, CSS and JavaScript, so I hope that you already know some basics of those three technologies. I think we are ready to start. I have created a new folder on the desktop called sign in, sign up form, which right now is empty. Let's go ahead and open it in VS Code and create the working files for HTML, CSS and JavaScript. We need index.html, then style.css and script.js. Then open index.html file and insert here the basic HTML document. For that I'm going to use an emmet. Let's place here an exclamation mark and hit tab or enter. Okay, let's go ahead and change the title. I'm going to insert here sign in, sign up form. And then after that, let's link the CSS and JavaScript files. I'm going to open link tag and specify the path of the CSS file. Then in order to link the JavaScript file, I'm going to open script tag right above the body. And in the source attribute, let's specify the path of the file. Okay, lastly, I'm going to run the project to the browser. For that, let's use one of the VS Code packages called Live Server. It allows us to run the project live to the browser and make updates without refreshing the page each time. So you can install and use this package. Alright, let's place the editor and browser side by side, like so, and get started. As usual, I'm going to start to create HTML markup. So let's open div tag, which is going to be the container. Then I'm going to insert here h1 heading element with a class heading. So the heading will consist of two different span elements. Let's open it with the class heading span1 and insert here the text sign. And then create the second span element with the class heading span2 and insert here in. Okay, that's it about the heading. Next, I'm going to create buttons. So let's open div tag, which is going to be the wrapper of the buttons. I'm going to assign to it class buttons. Then insert here button element with the class sign in btn. Let's insert here text sign in. Then I'm going to duplicate this line of code and change the class name. We need sign up and the text sign up. Okay, next I'm going to create a form, but before that let's insert here a div tag which is going to be the background of the form, I mean the triangle. Let's assign to it class form.bg. Then I'm going to open form tag. It will have two different classes. The first one is going to be form. As for the second one, let's insert here sign in. So overall we will have a single form element with 4 different input fields, and we will manage to display sign in and sign up parts using JavaScript. Okay, let's open div tag, which will be the wrapper of the input field and paragraph. Let's assign to it class form input wrapper. We will use the paragraph to display an error message. Let's insert here input element with type text. Besides that, I'm going to add to it a couple of attributes. Let's assign to it class form input. Then we need the ID, which is going to be username. And lastly, let's use a placeholder attribute with the value your name. Okay, that's it about the input element. Let's create the paragraph with the class message. By default, I'm going to insert here error message, but eventually we will define the error messages from JavaScript. Okay, so the first input field is created. Let's go ahead and duplicate div element 3 times and then make some changes. For the second input, we need ID email. Also change the placeholder attribute, insert here email address. Next, we will have input for the password. So let's change the type, make it a password. And also change ID and placeholder attributes. We need password for both of them. Okay, the last input is going to be for password confirmation. So I'm going to make the type of the input again password. As for the ID, it's going to be password2. And finally, change the placeholder attribute. I'm going to make it confirm password. Alright, the last element that we are going to create in the HTML document is going to be a submit button. So let's open input element with type submit. Also add here the value submit. And finally, use here class form.btn. Alright, so that's it regarding the HTML markup. Now we have to start to write the CSS. First of all, let's create some reset and common styles. Let's select every element using an asterisk and get rid of default margin and padding. I'm going to set both of them to 0. Besides that, let's set box sizing to border box. And also get rid of default outline from every element. Let's set outline to none. Next, I'm going to change the font family. Throughout this tutorial, we're going to use one of the Google fonts. So let's go to the Google Fonts website and search for a font called Inconsolata. Then select all different styles here. Grab the link and paste it in the head element. Let's change the font family. Let's insert here Inconsolata and monospace. Okay, that's it about the common and reset styles. I'm going to use rem as the measurement unit in this project. Right now, 1 rem equals 16 pixels because the font size of the HTML element is equal to 16 pixels by default. I want to convert 1 rem into 10 pixels, and for that we have to decrease the font size of the HTML element. Let's make it 62.5%. Okay, so as you can see, the elements became smaller. Let's go ahead and take care of the container. Let's select it and at first define width and height. I'm going to set width to 100%. As for the height, I'm going to set it to 100% of the viewport. Then I'm going to center the content, and for that let's use Flexbox. We need to change the direction. Let's make it column. And then, in order to place the content in the center, we need justify content center and align items center. Okay, so the elements are placed in the center, and with the container we are done. Let's move on and customize the heading. First of all, let's take care of its position. I'm going to move it up, so let's assign to it position absolute, and then define top position, make it 5 rem. So as you can see, the heading is positioned, and now I'm going to style it. At first, let's change the font size, make it 7 rem. Then I'm going to make the font lighter using font weight 300. Also change the color, make it F03535. Next, I'm going to create some space between the letters using letter spacing 1 rem. And also create some shadow effect using text shadow. Let's assign to it values 0.2 rem, 0.2 rem, 0.5 rem, and the color AAA. Okay, right now that's it about the heading. Let's move on and customize the buttons. At first, I'm going to define their positions, so let's select wrapper div element, which has the class name buttons, and set its position to absolute. And then define top and left properties. I'm going to set both of them to 5 rem. So the buttons are placed at the top left corner of the page, and next I'm going to place them vertically in a column. For that, let's use Flexbox. We need display flex and flex direction column. Okay, let's move on and select buttons. I'm in the button element itself. First of all, I'm going to define width and height. Let's make width 10 rem. As for the height, I'm going to set it to 4 rem. And also change the background color, make it white. After that, let's change the font size. I'm going to make it 2 rem. Also change the color. Let's use again color F03535. Then I'm going to get rid of default border. Let's set it to none. Also, I'm going to make the corners of the buttons rounded using border radius with the value of 5 rem. Next, let's create some space between the letters using letter spacing 0.1 rem. Also, I'm going to create a little shadow effect. So let's use box shadow with the values 0.3 rem, 0.3 rem, then 0.8 rem, and the color EEE. Then we need some space at the top and the bottom of the buttons. So let's use margin with the values 1 rem and 0. And finally, let's change the type of the cursor, make it pointer. Alright, so the buttons are styled, and now we have to take care of the form element. Let's go ahead and select it. I'm going to make form element flex container, so we need display flex. And also I'm going to change the direction. Let's set flex direction to column. Next, let's take care of the form input wrapper. But before that, I want to hide those paragraphs for a while. So let's go ahead and select them and assign to them display none. Okay, after that, let's select form input wrapper. I'm going to create some space at the top and bottom using margin. Let's set it to 1.5 rem and 0. Alright, let's go ahead and select input element itself and define, first of all, width and height. I'm going to set width to 50 rem. As for the height, let's make it 5 rem. Also change the background color, make it white. Then I'm going to increase font size. Let's make it 1.7 rem. Then create some space on the right and left sides inside of the input using padding. Let's make it 0 and 2 rem. And lastly, let's create some space between the letters using letter spacing 0.2 rem. Okay, so those were the common styles of the inputs, the inputs and the submit button. Now I'm going to select form input itself. Let's create some shadow using box shadow with the values 0.3 rem, 0.3 rem, 0.5 rem. Next we need color E. And also I'm going to add here one more value. I want to create shadow inside of the input, and for that we have to use value called inset. Okay, next let's change the color. Use here color 888. Alright, after that let's get rid of the default border for all input elements. So I'm going to set border to none, and also I'm going to make corners rounded using border radius with the value 5 rem. Okay, so right now input elements have box shadow inside of the field, and I'm going to create it outside of the element as well. For that, let's assign the box shadow property to the form input wrapper. Let's assign to it values 0.5 rem 3 times and the color E. And besides that, we need border radius with the value 5 rem. Okay, so now each input field has a box shadow inside and outside, which makes them look good. Let's go ahead and take care of the submit button. We see here just the text submit. So let's go ahead and select this element, and at first create shadow using box shadow. I'm going to pass here values 0.5 rem, 0.5 rem, 1 rem, and the color D. Also, let's change the color of the text. Let's use again red color F0 3535. Next, I'm going to create some space at the top and bottom using margin. Let's set it to 2 rem and 0. Also, let's create some space between the letters. Use letter spacing 0.2 rem. And then make the font bolder using font weight bold. Okay, so the submit button looks good. Next, I want to create a little hover effect. I'm going to increase the box shadow slightly once we hover over the button. So let's select form btn with hover and assign to it box shadow with the values 0.5 rem, 0.5 rem, 2 rem, and the color D. Okay, so the last thing that we have to do before we add the functionality to our project is to create a background. As you know, we have an empty div element in the HTML document with the class form bg. So let's go ahead and select this element. And at first, let's set its position to absolute. Then I'm going to set width and height, both of them, to 65 rem. Also use here box shadow with 1.5 rem 3 times and the color D. Okay, finally I want to rotate this element by 45 degrees and it will create a triangle effect. So let's use transform with a rotate function and insert here 45 degrees. Okay, so as you can see, we are done with the background. Actually, right now we have a little issue here. I can't focus on the inputs. So in order to fix that, let's assign to the form element the index property with some higher value, let's say 100. Alright, so now the problem is fixed, and actually with the styling we are done for now. We need to add some functionality to the project. Before we start to write some JavaScript, I want to do a couple of things in CSS. Once we focus the inputs, then I want to increase the box shadow inside of the input field. So I'm going to select form input with a focus pseudo class. and then insert here box shadow with the following values: 0.5 rem, 0.5 rem, 1 rem, then the color E, and also we need here the value in set. Then use transition. I want to assign transition property to all input elements, including the submit button, because it also has a box shadow effect on hover. So let's define transition with the values box shadow and 0.3 second. Okay, so now we have a much better effect. I'm going to change the cursor type for the submit button, so let's make it pointer. Alright, now it's time to add some functionality to the project. Let's take a look at the finished version. By the way, we don't have here the triangle background because the finished project is already responsive. So I'm going to program those two buttons. As you can see, by default the sign in button has a different background color, and once we click the sign up button, then the background colors will change. Besides that, the second part of the heading is changing accordingly, and also the proper input fields are displaying on click. So we're going to do those three things. At first, let's get rid of default white background color from those buttons. Then select the sign in button and change the background color. I'm going to use here color E7, E7, E7. Then select sign up button and make its background color white. Alright, now I'm going to change the background colors on click. Let's go to the script.js file. So we need to attach to both buttons event listeners with the click event. Then once we click the sign up button, we need to add to the container a new class which will be used in CSS, and we will define new styles with the help of this class. So first of all, let's go ahead and select container. I'm going to create new variable container and then select container using query selector method. We need to specify here the class container. After that, I'm going to select the sign up button and attach to it an event listener. So let's go ahead and use again query selector method and specify here the class name sign up btn. Then attach to it an event listener with click event, and also we have to pass here the callback function, which will be executed once we click the button. So when we click the sign up button, then we have to add to the container a new class. So we need here container followed by the class list property, which stores all the classes that the element has. So in order to add the class to the container, I'm going to use a method called add, and inside the parentheses we have to specify the name of the class. Let's call it change. Alright, let's go to the CSS file and select the sign up button but with the class change, and then set background color to E7, E7, E7. So now if I click the sign up button, then its background color will change. But actually it's not enough. As you see, sign in button still has the gray background color. So let's go back to the JavaScript file. Now we have to attach to the sign in button an event listener, and we need to remove class change from the container. So let's go ahead and select sign in button using query selector method, and then attach to it event listener. Let's pass here click event and also the callback function. So as we said, we have to remove class change from the container. Let's go ahead and grab this line of code, and instead of method called add, let's use remove. Then go to the CSS file and, like the sign up button, select sign in button with the class change and set its background color to white. Okay, so now as you can see, everything looks fine. The background colors are changing. The only thing that we have to do is to add a transition effect to the buttons. So let's use transition with background color and with the duration 0.3 seconds. Alright, so now we have a much better effect. Next, I'm going to take care of the heading. Once we click the buttons, we should change the second part of the heading accordingly. At first, I'm going to change it without any effects, and then once we manage to change the content, then we will add some nice effects. Let's go to the JavaScript file, and at first, let's select the second span element in the heading. I'm going to create a new variable. Let's call it heading span2. And then select span element using query selector method. Let's pass here class name heading span2. So in order to change the content of the element, I'm going to use one of the properties called text content. So we need heading span2 followed by the text content property, and we have to assign to it up. Let's copy this code, paste it down below, and change up into in. Okay, so if I click the buttons, then the content will change accordingly. So everything works fine, and now, as I said, I'm going to add some nice effects to this change. Let's take a look at the finished project once again. So when I click the buttons, then the white box is moving from right to left, and it creates a nice effect. This white box is going to be the after pseudo element of the span. First of all, let's create these elements. We need heading span2 followed by the after pseudo element. At first, let's define the content. I'm going to make it empty. And then set position to absolute. I'm going to define the position of this element according to its parent, which is span element itself. So I'm going to assign to the span element position relative. Then define the width and height of the box. I'm going to set both of them to 100%. And also give it some temporary background, different from the white color, because I want to make the box visible. Let's use here color light gray. So now the box is visible, and next I'm going to define its position. By default, I'm going to place it on the right side. Let's set right position to -100%. Alright, so when I click the sign up button, this box should move to the left side. And in order to achieve that, I'm going to use again class change followed by the heading span2 with after pseudo element. So in order to move the element, I'm going to set right position to 100%. So now if I click the buttons, then the box will move. Let's add to it a little transition. Let's assign to it right and 0.6 seconds. Now the box is moving with a smooth transition. Okay, so as you can see, when the box moves to the left side, then it ends up on top of the heading. I'm in the first span element. So we need to fix that, and we can manipulate with the z-index property. Let's select the first span element, which has class heading span1, and set the index property to 10. Okay, so now the problem is fixed, and the only thing that we have to do is to add some delay time before the content is changed, because right now at first the content is changing and then the box is moving, and actually it doesn't look good. I'm going to create delay using one of the built-in functions called setTimeout. Let's go to the script.js file and insert here setTimeout. This function takes two arguments. The first one is the callback function, which is executed after some time, and the amount of this time is going to be the second argument. Let's insert here this line of code. As for the timeout, you need to specify it in milliseconds. So let's insert here 200. Let's copy this code and paste it down here. I'm going to change up into in. So now if I click the buttons, then the effect will work fine. The only thing that I have to do is to get rid of this temporary color and insert here white color. Okay, so now we have a nice and cool effect. Alright, so with the heading we are done, and now we have to take care of the input fields. By default we need to display email and password inputs, and once we click the sign up button, then we have to display back the first and the last inputs. So let's go ahead and hide the first and the last input fields. I'm going to select them using nth child selector. Actually, we need to select form input wrapper. We need here nth child 1, then duplicate the selector and change the number, insert here 4. So in order to hide those elements, I'm going to use visibility hidden and opacity 0. Okay, so as you can see, the inputs are hidden, but now the submit button is too far from those inputs. So let's take care of that. I'm going to set position to relative, and then in order to move the element up, let's use top position with the value -6 rem. Okay, now when we click the sign up button, we have to do a couple of things. We need to display back the first and the last inputs. I'm going to duplicate this code. Then let's add to both selectors class change. Then we need to change the values. Instead of visibility hidden, we need visibility visible and opacity 1. Besides that, we need to move the submit button back to its default position. So let's select submit button with class change and set top position to 1 rem. Okay, so if we click the sign up button, then everything will work fine. Now to make this change nicer, we have to use transition. At first, let's add a transition to the input wrappers. We need here values all and 0.3 second. Then we need transition with class change, and also we need here to use some delay time. So when we click the sign up button, then this transition will work, and once we click the sign in button, then this transition will work. Alright, so with input fields we are done. Let's add a transition to the submit button. By default, I'm going to set transition to top, then the duration 0.3 second, and also the delay time 0.3 second. And also we need transition here with the values top and 0.3 second. Okay, so if I click the sign up button, then the submit button will move smoothly, but once I click the sign in button, then we won't have any transition effect. The reason is that we used transition with input elements, and actually this selector has the higher precedence. So I'm going to get rid of transition from here and add box shadow down below in both cases. So now if I test, then everything will work perfectly. Okay, so the next thing that we have to do is to validate all those input fields. First of all, I'm going to select all 4 input elements and store them into the variables. Let's go ahead and create the first variable, which is going to be username. As you remember, input elements have the IDs, so I'm going to select username using getElementById method. We have to pass here the ID username. Let's duplicate this line of code 3 times and change the names of the variables and also the IDs. The second one is going to be email. Then we will have password and password 2. Alright, at first let's check if the input fields are empty or not. I'm going to create the function. Let's go ahead and call it check required fields. I'm going to use here an arrow function. So this function will take one parameter, which is going to be an array, and it will include all the input fields. So as the parameter, I'm going to insert here input array. So in order to check if input fields are empty or not, at first we need to loop through the array, and for that I'm going to use one of the array helper methods called forEach. It takes one argument, which is going to be the callback function. This function itself takes one parameter, and I'm going to pass here input. It's going to be the current input element during the loop. Alright, so now we need to check if the value of the input is empty or not. So we need to use if-else statement. And as the condition, I'm going to pass here input.value triple equals to empty string. Actually, input.value is not quite enough here, because if we enter something in the input field with a white space, then this white space will be recognized as the part of the value, which we don't need. So to avoid this kind of thing, in order to ignore the white space, we can use one of the methods called trim. Okay, so if this condition is true, then we have to display an error message. Let's just put here the comment. And if it is false, then we need an else statement in which we have to change the color of the border of the input into green. So let's insert here success for a while. So in order to do those two things, I'm going to create two different functions. Let's start with the error message. I'm going to create a new function. Let's call it error. It will take two parameters. The first one is going to be the input element. As for the second one, it's going to be a message. So now we need to get access to the form input wrapper, which is a parent element of the input. We will add a new class to the wrapper, and with the help of this new class, we will manage to display an error message. Okay, let's go ahead and create a variable. I'm going to call it input wrapper. So in order to get access to the input wrapper, we need input followed by the property called parent element. Now we have to add a new class to the input wrapper, and for that I'm going to use one of the properties called class name. Let's insert here class, let's say error. Actually, this element has its own class, which is a form input wrapper. If we leave here just an error, then it will override the existing class. So in order to avoid it, let's insert here form input wrapper as well. Alright, next I'm going to select the paragraph. We can do it using document, but in this case, only the first found paragraph will be selected. So instead of document, I'm going to use input wrapper followed by the query selector method, and inside the parentheses we have to specify the class of the paragraph message. Alright, now we need to change the content of the error message. For that, let's use text content property, and it should be equal to the message. Okay, so the function for the error message is ready. We can call it down below inside of the if statement. It should take two arguments. The first one is going to be the input. As for the second one, it's going to be the message. So let's open backticks, because I'm going to use template literals. So I'm going to pass here the ID of the input. As you know, all four inputs have the IDs. And then it should be followed by the text is required. Alright. In order to execute this code, we have to call this function, and it should happen once we submit the form. So we need to attach to the form element an event listener with a submit event. At first, let's select the form element. Let's create new variable and select the form element using query selector method. Then attach to it an event listener. I'm going to pass here submit event and also the callback function, which will be executed once we submit the form. At first, let's run something to the console. Let's say submitted. So if I click the submit button, then we will get submitted in the console, but as you can see, it's flashing, and it happens because by default submit button reloads the page. In order to prevent this behavior, we have to use a method called prevent default, and we have to attach it to the event object. So let's pass here event object and then use prevent default method, which should be attached to the event object. Now if I click the submit button, then the problem will be fixed. Okay, so now we can call the function check required fields. It should take one argument, which is going to be an array of input fields. So let's pass here all four inputs. I mean username, email, password, and password too. Okay, so at this time we won't see the error messages because we have to write some CSS. Right now the paragraphs are hidden, so I'm going to make them visible. Let's get rid of display none. So we see here hard-coded error messages, and if I click the submit button, then we will get the error messages which we have just defined from the JavaScript. If I enter some characters in one of the inputs, then we will get an error message from the empty input field. Okay, let's go ahead and customize the paragraph. First of all, I'm going to set its position to absolute. Then, in order to position paragraph according to the input wrapper, let's assign to it position relative. And then add some more styles to the paragraph. I'm going to define left position and make it 2 rem. Then change the font size, make it 1.2 rem. Also, I'm going to make the font bolder using font weight 700. Then create some space between the letters using letter spacing 0.1 rem. Also transform text into uppercase. Then create some space at the top of the element using margin top 1 rem. And lastly, change the color, make it F55E5E. Alright, so the paragraph is customized. By default, it should be hidden, and we need to display error messages on submit. So let's hide the paragraphs using visibility hidden and opacity 0. So now by default error messages are hidden, and in order to display them we have to use class error followed by the message. We have to pass here visibility visible and also opacity 1. Lastly, let's use transition, insert here opacity and the duration 0.3 seconds. So if I click the submit button, then we will get error messages with nice transition. Actually, we have here a tiny issue. As you see, for the last input element we have an error message saying that password 2 is required, and actually it doesn't make sense. I want to change this message. For that we need to use another if statement in which we have to check if the ID of the input is equal to password 2. So let's put this condition here. So if this is true, then we have to call function called error. We have to pass here input and the error message password confirmation is required. Next we need to use else statement, and we have to pass this line of code here. Okay, now if we test, then everything will work fine. So right now with the error messages we are done. Let's move on and take care of the success. If we enter some data in the input fields, then we have to make the border of the input green. For that I'm going to use the similar technique. Let's create a new function called success. It will take one parameter, which is going to be the input. So again, we have to access the input wrapper and add to it a new class. Let's create variable input wrapper, which should be equal to input.parent element. And then we have to add a new class to the input wrapper. So we need input wrapper.className. And again, we have to pass here two classes. The first one is the class of the input wrapper, I mean form input wrapper. And then we have to pass here success. Okay, let's go to the CSS file and select input element with the class success and give it a green border. Let's pass here point 1 rem, solid, and the color 46E75B. Okay, so let's go to the JavaScript file and call the function inside the else statement. This function will take one argument, which is going to be input. So if I fill the input and click the submit button, then we will get a green border without any error message. Alright, actually we have to fix here a couple of issues. If I click the submit button and then display the sign up form, then all input fields will have the error messages. Actually we don't need them. When we check one of the forms and then switch to another one, the error messages should be gone. So for the sign-in form, we need a different array as the argument of the check required fields function. We need just two inputs, email and password. As for the sign-up form, we need all four input elements. Right now, the form element has two classes, form and sign-in. So when we click the sign-up button, we have to change sign-in into sign-up, and we need the opposite when we click the sign-up button. So I'm going to pass here form.className, and we need to assign to it two different classes, form and sign up. And we need the similar to the sign in form. So let's pass here form.className equal to form sign in. Now I'm going to use the if-else statement, in which we have to check if the form does have sign up class. So as the condition, we need here form.classList. This property stores all the classes that the element has. Then in order to access the second class of the element, we have to pass here 1 in square brackets. It should be equal to sign up. So if it is true, then the array should include all four input elements. And if it is false, then we need else statement, in which we will just check email and password inputs. So let's call the function check required fields. Insert here an array with two input fields, email and password. Okay, now if I click the submit button, then we will get error messages. And if I switch to sign up form, then the first and the last inputs will display without error messages. As for the second and third inputs, they will still have the errors. Okay, so it works, but I want to remove those error messages as well once we switch to the sign up form. In order to achieve that, we have to remove classes error and success from the input wrappers, and it should happen when we click those buttons. Besides that, I'm going to manage to clear the input fields, so let's go ahead and create a new function. I'm going to call it clear form. Then in order to select all the input wrappers, let's use a method called query selector all. We have to specify here the class name form input wrapper. So this method returns an array-like object called node list, and we can loop through this list using for each method. So let's use it. Pass here callback function, which will take one parameter. It's going to be the current item in the list. And then we need item.className equal to form input wrapper. So in this case, if the input wrapper has either error or success classes, then they will be removed because again, the class name property overrides the old classes with the new ones. Okay, besides that, I'm going to clear the input fields if they are not empty using reset function. We have to attach it to the form. Alright, now we need to call this function twice. So if I click the submit button and then switch to the sign up form, the error messages will be gone. And also if I fill any of the inputs and then switch to the sign up form, input will be cleared as well. Okay, so everything works fine so far, but we have to add a couple of things to our form validation. Next, I'm going to check the length of the input values. So in case of the username, the value must be between 2 and 15 characters. As for the password, the length of the value must be between 5 and 25 characters. So let's go ahead and create a new function. I'm going to call it checkLength. It will take 3 parameters. The first one is going to be the input element. As for the rest of the parameters, they should be minimum and maximum numbers of the characters. So let's pass here min and max. Alright, so now we have to check some conditions using if-else statements. At first, I'm going to check if the length of the input value is less than minimum. So we need input.value.length is less than min. If this condition is true, then we have to display the error message. So we need to call the error function. It takes 2 arguments. The first one is the input. As for the second one, it's going to be the error message. Let's open backticks and pass here again input ID. Then we need some text. Must be at least. Then we have to pass here min followed by the characters. Okay, next we need else if statement because we have to check if the length of the input value is greater than maximum or not. So as the condition, we have to pass here input.value.length is greater than max. So if this is true, then again we have to call a function called error. Actually, let's grab this line of code, paste it here and make some changes. We need here must be less than, and instead of min, I'm going to pass here max. So if both conditions are false, then it means that we have a success and we need to call function success in the else statement. Let's pass here argument input. Okay, finally we have to call this function and we have to call it twice because we need to check the length for the username and the password as well. So let's call function checkLength with the following arguments. We need username, then 2 and 15. Let's duplicate this line of code, change username into password and also pass here 5 and 25. Okay, let's test if it works. I'm going to enter 1 character in the username input field. As for the password, let's enter here 3 characters. So if I click the submit button, then we will get the proper error messages. Okay, so with the checkLength function we are done. Next I'm going to check if passwords match or not. It's going to be a kind of simple function. Let's call it passwords match. It should take 2 parameters. I'm going to call them input1 and input2. Next we need if statements in which we have to check if the value of the input 1 not equals to the value of the input 2. So if this condition is true, it means that passwords do not match, so we need to call error function. Let's pass here input 2 and then the error message, passwords do not match. Okay, let's go ahead and call this function down below. I'm going to pass here password and password 2. So if I fill both input fields with different passwords and then click the submit button, then we will get an error saying that passwords do not match. Alright, the last thing that we have to do is to check if the user enters the valid email address. Let's go ahead and create a new function. I'm going to call it check email. It will take one parameter input. So to validate the email address, we have to use regular expressions. I'm not going to write them manually because it consists of lots of different characters and it might be quite confusing for you. We can simply search for it in Google. Let's search for JavaScript, regex for email. Then go to the first link and grab this variable here and paste it in the function. Let's change the name of the variable. I'm going to call it regex. So now we have to check if email input value matches those requirements. For that we need if statement. Then we need to use a method called test, and as the argument we have to pass here an input value, again with the trim method. So if this is true, then we have success. So we need to call function success with the argument input. And if it is false, we need else statement, in which we need to call the function error with the arguments input and the error message email is not valid. Okay, finally, let's call this function. We can either call it in both statements because we need to check email in both forms, or we can just call it once outside of the if-else statement. As the argument, let's pass here email. Alright, so if I enter here some characters and click the submit button, then we will get an error message saying that email is not valid. But if I enter here something like the email address, let's say john@gmail.com, then we will get success. Okay, so with the form validation we are almost done. The only thing that I want to do is to add to all the input elements an attribute called Autocomplete and set it to off, because when I focus the input fields we see here some previously entered values, so I want to turn it off, and for that let's add to all the inputs attribute Autocomplete and make it off. Okay, so finally our forms are validated and now we can move on to the last part of the tutorial and make our project responsive. Let's go ahead and inspect the page and switch to the responsive mode. As I said at the beginning of this tutorial, we have built this project on extra large screen size, and now we have to make it look good on different screen sizes as well. I have already prepared the breakpoints, so I'm not going to waste time on that. So the first breakpoint on which we need to make some changes is going to be 1400 pixels. On the breakpoint I'm going to rotate the background and also decrease its height. So let's go ahead and create CSS media query, then specify max width, make it 1400 pixels. Then I'm going to select form background. We need to use transform with the rotate function, and as the argument I'm going to pass here 0. As for the height, let's make it 55 rem. Okay, so that's it about this breakpoint. Let's move on to the next one, which is going to be 1000 pixels. So let's create new media query. Specify max width as 1000 pixels. So on the breakpoint, I'm going to decrease the font size of the heading. Let's make it 5 rem. Then I'm going to change the width of the inputs. So let's select them and set width to 40 rem. Next, I'm going to customize the background. So let's select it. I'm going to set width to 55 rem. As for the height, let's make it 50 rem. And besides that, I'm going to set margin at the bottom to 10 rem. Okay, that's it about 1000 pixels. Let's move on and find the next breakpoint. It's going to be 700 pixels. So let's go ahead and create new CSS media query with the max width 700 pixels. First of all, I'm going to decrease the font size of the HTML. Let's make it 55%. Then let's take care of the heading. I'm going to change the font size. Let's make it 4 rem. And also change the top position, make it 2 rem. Okay. After that, let's go ahead and work on the buttons. Let's select wrapper development and change the position. I'm going to set left property to 2 rem. As for the top, let's make it 2 rem as well. Next, let's select button itself. I'm going to set width to 7 rem. Then change the height, make it 3 rem. And also change the font size. I'm going to set it to 1.7 rem. Alright, that's it about the buttons. Next, I'm going to decrease the size of the background of the form. Let's go ahead and select it. Let's set height to 45 rem. As for the width, let's make it 45 rem as well. Besides that, I'm going to decrease the size of the input fields. So let's select input and set its width to 35 rem. Alright, so with that breakpoint we are done, and now we have to move on and create the last breakpoint, which is going to be 450 pixels. So let's go ahead and create new CSS media and specify the max width as 450 pixels. So on the breakpoint, I'm going to change just the font size of the HTML. Let's set it to 42%. Alright, so that's it about the project. It's responsive to different screen sizes, and actually we have finished working on it. I hope you enjoyed the video and learned some new stuff. As I said at the beginning of this tutorial, you should definitely know how to deal with the form validation, so hopefully you got some good practice in it. If you like this video, then please thumbs up, comment below, share it, subscribe to our channel and click the bell to get notified on coming tutorials. Okay, see you next time.